As we go farther into space, there will be loss of life. Whether during launch, an extended journey, or on the moon, Mars, or in orbit, there will be casualties. How will we deal with death in space? What do you do to a body that might not be able to return to Earth? Do we set them adrift like burial in sea, or stuff them in a refrigerator for return? Listen in and find out, coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust. This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode 25, recorded July 22nd, 2022, for August 19th, 2022, a beginner's guide to dying in space. This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by Melissa. Poor data quality can cost organizations an average of $15 million each year. Make sure your customer contact data is up to date. Get started today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Beginner's Guide to Dying in Space edition. I'm Rod Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra Magazine, and I'm joined by the redoubtable guest host, Geoffrey Notkin, and also...
Greetings!
Hello! How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Captain Rod. Nice to be back on board.
Thanks for coming. Geoff is a fellow science writer, star of TV's Meteorite Men, and governor of the National Space Society. And today, we're going to catch up with my old friend, NASA flight surgeon Bill Tarver, to discuss how we will face and deal with a death in space. While not desirable, it's an inevitability in the long haul. Thanks for coming on today, Bill.
Glad to be here.
So, Bill, I'm sorry to subject you to this because I like you and you're a nice guy, but we always begin with a space joke or two. You probably know some flight surgeon jokes, which you should feel free to share. But as I discovered earlier this week, at least where I looked, they were few and far between. However, I have these medical gems. What did the doctor say to the rocket ship? It's time to get your booster shot.
Oh, that's a good one.
Or yesterday I was talking to an alien. Turns out they eat radioactive materials. I asked it what its favorite meal was, and it said fish and chips.
Oh, that's also a winner. Was it wrapped in newspaper?
Probably. British newsprint. Geoff, do you have one for me?
Oh, of course. I have two.
Oh, good.
Captain Rod, why did a member of the rock band's rhythm section say he was always most relaxed while doing concerts on the moon?
I don't know. Why did he say that?
Because he was a tranquility bass player.
Wow. You wrote that?
Yeah.
I am so impressed. Okay.
Oh,
one more.
Thanks. And, okay, simple one. What is the space miner's decorative accessory of choice? Of course.
What is the space miner's decorative accessory of choice?
Has to be an asteroid belt. I got the crickets!
You got the crickets. You win. All right. Let's bang through a couple of headlines, and then I got a lot of questions for Dr. Tarver. First up, Artemis on track from space.com. The flight of Artemis 1 has finally got a launch date. The uncrewed mission around the moon and back to Earth is slated to launch on one of three dates, actually, depending on weather, technical difficulties, or traffic jams of other flights at the launch site. The first date is August 29th, the second, September 2nd, and the third would be September 5th. NASA did caution that there were still repairs to be done to the system, so those dates could conceivably slide by a bit. They concluded the press event by saying they would know better about a week before the first projected launch date. So stay tuned to space.com for more information on that. Next up,
there's an excellent, if I may, Rod, there's an excellent piece by science writer Elizabeth Howell on space.com called NASA's Artemis 1 Moon Mission Explained in Photos. It's a fascinating piece. And do I understand correctly that the plan is for it to orbit the moon for 19 days?
The actual duration of the mission, last I looked anyway, was still up in the air. No joke intended. But it's a long mission. One of the big goals, besides testing everything out, of course, is to try that high-speed reentry, because they haven't done that for an awful long time, and they're using new heat shield materials that are presenting some challenges.
And deploying the CubeSats too, if I understand, to carry out a whole host of science experiments, including moon, asteroids, and deep space radiation environment, a topic very apropos for today's show.
That's absolutely true. All right, next up, they walk or crawl or wiggle among us, which is also from space.com. It's becoming increasingly clear that the basic elements necessary for life are spread throughout the universe after all. After centuries of speculation about life out there, recent results from the James Webb Space Telescope, which we've talked about in the show, were written up by professors at the University of Arizona. While we suspect there might be life, ancient or otherwise, on Mars or the moons of the outer solar system, it's likely to be very challenging to detect it in both those places, especially with robots. And with the Webb Space Telescope in operation now, many scientists think it's likely that we'll actually find indications of possible life on exoplanets orbiting other stars first. It's thought there are at least 300 million potentially habitable planets in our galaxy alone, and several of these are within 30 light years of Earth, where the Webb can easily perform spectral analysis of their atmospheres. The recent squiggly line science data released by NASA in the first batch of Webb photos showed how this might be done, and the article was optimistic that there would be more in short order. Specifically, they'll be looking at the TRAPPIST-1 exoplanet system in just a couple of months, so stay tuned on that. And be sure to check out space.com for all the latest news.
Sorry to step on you there, Rob. Listeners, if you have not enjoyed episode 18 of This Week in Space, it deals with this topic in some fascinating detail when we spoke with Mark Clampin of NASA and discussed how the James Webb Telescope might be used to look for signs of extraterrestrial life, one of my favorite topics.
Very good memory, Geoffrey. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast. All right, we'll be back to talk with Bill Tarver in a minute after this short message, so stay with us. This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by Melissa. Do you know that poor data quality can cost organizations an average of $15 million each and every year? If you're a small to medium-sized business, we know you need every last cent. The longer poor quality data stays in your system, the more losses you can accumulate. To ensure your business is successful, your customer information needs to be accurate. Melissa is a leading provider of global data quality and address management solutions. There's another side to inaccurate data, customer service. If you address someone with the wrong name or verify the wrong address when dealing with an already frustrated customer, things can go from bad to worse in a hurry. Check out Melissa's cloud-based data cleansing and enrichment tool. It's so easy to use. Step 1, upload your file, Excel or CSV, into the first tab, or copy and paste your data, CSV, into the second tab. Step 2, select a data quality service and click Next. Step 3, map the input fields. Step 4, select output fields and data to append. Step 5, process your list. Melissa's data matching will help eliminate clutter and duplicates, reducing postage and mailing costs. You'll also get batch address cleansing. You can process an entire address list for accuracy and completeness. Name verification. You can parse and standardize first and last names for personalization. Profiling. Analyze your data to improve its quality over time. And email verification. You can remove up to 95% of bad email addresses from your database. Melissa's flexible deployment options offer different platforms to suit any preference, business size, or budget. Melissa also has their new Lookups app on iOS and Google to search addresses, names, and more at your fingertips. Melissa continually undergoes independent security audits to reinforce its commitment to data security, privacy, and compliance requirements. They are SOC 2, HIPAA, and GDPR compliant. Melissa's data quality suite and clean suite speaks for itself, but was once again named a leader by G2. Melissa is experienced, independent, and has 37 years of data quality expertise, which explains why more than 10,000 businesses know them as the address experts. And if you sign up for a service level agreement, you'll get 24/7 world-renowned support from their global support center. Make sure your customer contact data is up to date. Get started today with 1,000 records clean for free at melissa.com/twit. That's melissa.com/twit. And we're back. So, Bill, let's start with learning a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and what you've been up to.
Well, I'm a physician. That kind of kind of helps. I am not a pathologist, but I work in space medicine at NASA, and I've been there about 15 plus years now. And look forward to the future of space. Really, we've got lots of things coming, a lot of challenges for humans going into space with the commercial space development. So we got lots on the plate in the world of space, commercial, and government, and I look forward to it.
Well, and you're headquartered at the Johnson Space Center still, correct?
Yes, home of the U.S. astronauts.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is sort of ground zero for everybody that's coming and going off Earth. So that's incredibly exciting. So one of the main thing we want to talk about today was dying in space. This is something that's going to happen eventually. We've been pretty lucky so far overall in terms of the numbers, but as we go further and further from Earth and stay other places longer, whether it's the moon, Mars, or elsewhere, even if it's just natural causes or age, we're going to have people dying up there. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how NASA differentiates between a flight accident, natural causes, and what the long view is on that.
Yeah. So let's see. We work pretty hard in general, in the government programs. You envision correctly that we work really hard to select best of the best, so to speak, very healthy individuals, mentally and physically, to go into space. And with that process, we reduce risk, and that's what the program's always been designed to do: reduce risk, right? And there's all sorts of risk out there. Going into space is risky business in and of itself. So the fact that we don't have people dying in space is just not coincidence between engineering and medicine and all that sort of stuff. It reduced the risk overall. But as we go forward, there's more and more people going into space, right? At this time, we've had how many people? About 550, maybe pushing 600
I think we're getting
overall.
close to 600. Yeah.
Yeah. On a planet of billions of people, that's still not a lot. And all the national programs select the best of the best and put them up. But when you start looking at the commercial world, it's going to change who gets sent into space, right? And so whether we have an accident and a vehicle, like catastrophic accidents we've had in the past, those have been the forms of death that we've experienced in the U.S. space program. As far as actually dying in space, there's really only 3 people that have actually died in space. So I guess one of the questions is, well, there's two things that come to my mind. One, what is space? And we say above the carbon line. So that's 100,000 kilometers or 61 miles above the planet, according to the federal, the international standard, right?
Right.
So you got to be in space, one, and then two, there's a lot of discussion. We all have concepts about death in and of itself, but it's got a lot of legal built into it. And I'm not a lawyer, but where you die has a whole lot to do with the legal, legal oversight, right? So if you die in the U.S., heck, if you die, I'm in Houston, so we have our own Houston medical examiner and system and laws, and California, Los Angeles, all these other jurisdictions, legal jurisdictions are going to have different ways of actually saying someone's dead. So we're going to have to generalize a little bit. And to die, in the medical terms, really, you stop brain function, you stop heart function. So the big 3 things are brain, heart, and breathing. And on TV, they show this all the time. People die all the time, and everybody seems to know it, right? But it's a little more challenging to know someone's not in a suppressed state versus actually the brain's not functioning anymore. So it's going to be challenging in space if we have someone who doesn't have a catastrophic accident. Obviously, if your head separates from your shoulders, I think we can all call that one. But what if, you go to check on your buddy Joe in the space cabin and he's just not talking to you, not responded? So that's a different scenario altogether, right? Mm. How do you know that person actually is dead? It gets a little more complicated.
I thought it was, if you look at it on TV, it's always just when the machines stop beeping next to the gurney. But
that's helpful.
Yeah, I can see where it's more.
That's going to be helpful. But that's a whole nother thing. In the space world, there's this thing called power, mass, and volume, a mantra. Power, mass, and volume. We don't get to take extra pieces of equipment just to do something like go beep, 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 and then stop beeping when you die. What you can take into space and utilize for making medical calls. And we're not going to take anything into space right now that's specific, I don't think. We don't have anything that I know of in any program anywhere that's like, oh, this is just for pronouncing death in space. So just power, mass, and volume. What are you going to take and what can you utilize? We have so much capability built into our thinking on the ground, from the local ambulance, the local emergency room, all that sort of stuff, vastly outstrips what we can do in space right now. And what priorities will be put by the companies or the nations as they put vehicles in space? What priorities will they place on medical care, and then obviously making a call about death in space? And then once you are dead, what do you do with a body? There's a whole lot that goes into earthbound, taking care of the deceased. That's culturally sensitive to the people that are the family, the survivors, sensitive to the individual who's already passed away. That takes a lot of stuff, just material, right? And I don't think we have any stuff particularly dedicated to that in any of our programs at this point.
Okay.
I have a feeling we're going to dig into this potentially slightly grim topic in some detail in the next few minutes, Bill. I'd like to first know, though, a little bit about your career path. You're a flight surgeon. Was your passion to become a doctor first, and then you moved into the spaceflight world, or have you always been a spaceflight enthusiast? What was the guiding light in getting you to this point in your career?
I'd say the guiding light really was aviation. My family didn't have doctors in it, so I didn't grow up knowing I'd be a doctor. I kind of got there by a hook or by crook. But aviation, I always had a fascination or a passion for aviation. I grew up in a little place called Victoria, Texas, and above us, the Navy used to fly, and they did all these, aerial combat maneuver kind of things in the A4 Skyhawks. And so as I grew up and I was an athletic trainer in high school, I just clearly remember if I wasn't watching, the players on the field, I was watching the jets in the sky. So aviation kind of had my imagination. I really didn't think about getting into the space program. Went off to college, not to be a doctor, was thinking going to be an athletic trainer. Then decided, hey, maybe I could go to medical school. Went to medical school with a U.S. Air Force scholarship. They will, the military branches, will pay for you to go to medical school if you earn their scholarship. And then since I was the Air Force paid for it, I went to be a flight surgeon. So that's aviation and medicine. It was a pretty good deal. So I was a flight surgeon for several years, then got specialized training in aerospace medicine. You've all heard of general surgeons, family practice doctors. Those are all specialties that a lot more doctors do than aerospace medicine. But there is a specialty called aerospace medicine. It's one of the 3 preventive medicine specialties. There's aerospace, occupational medicine, and general preventive medicine. And so I trained with the Air Force Aerospace Medicine residency. It was a 3-year program during which one of the first things you do is get a master's in public health. When I went to medical school, preventive medicine really wasn't discussed. It was all about you wait for the disease to come to you. The individual with the problem came to you, but prevention was, well, you do a physical every year. That it was kind of glossed over. Well, my job right now is all about prevention. Once you send someone into space, they're kind of far away from the local ER. And so you really want them to not have a problem that you could have predicted earlier on. So anyway, I did aviation. I was a flight surgeon in the Air Force for several years. Then I went into private practice, and then I got a couple of phone calls. I was talking with friends at Johnson Space Center. And they're like, well, we got a job open here. And I'm like, I got my own practice. I'm having good enough time. I can't see going working for a big bureaucracy. And I don't know if anyone's told y'all, but NASA is a bit of a bureaucracy. So I was going to go from being my own boss to being, one of those workers. Well, one day I said, I'll come visit. And what hooked me totally was I went into the flight medicine clinic at Johnson Space Center. And at the time, it was basically the same building for the last 50 years or so. It's the clinic. And on the wall are all these pictures. You see all the shuttle missions that have come and gone, and everybody signed them. But the ones that really got my imagination or caught me were the ones that were on the moon and looking back at Earth, or they were the moonwalkers that had photos on there. And there's one signed by Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Mike Collins. And if I remember right, that's the one that was a picture on the moon looking at the Earth, and it said, help, I can't find the clinic. And then I talked to the people there. I said, could I meet somebody like Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin and the like? And they're like, yes, because there's a program at NASA. We bring astronauts back every year and check on their health. It's called Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health. And we just monitor them over the years, and we give them a good physical and kind of see how things are going. So once you're an astronaut, you're invited back every year, and we check on your health, and we learned, and you learn as an astronaut what's going on. And from that point on, I'm like, if I can meet them, I'll come here. You got me. And the wife had already said we could at least think about it, so I didn't get in too much trouble when we decided to move to balmy Houston.
And balmy it is, especially this time of year. So you kind of touched on this. And by the way, congratulations for being a chronic overachiever. One thing I love about doing this podcast is we're constantly talking to chronic overachievers. So I'm humbled in your presence. But you kind of touched on the idea of when somebody dies in space flight, let's say extended space flight on the way to Mars. So you're looking at 5 to 7 months one way. You've got cultural considerations depending on where the astronaut is from and what their cultural or religious background is. You've got psychological considerations for the crew, and I'd love to touch on both those things. But I think prominent in my thinking, and probably a lot of people listening to this, is what do you do with the body? And I did some reading on this prior to the interview today, and there seems to be a lot of different ideas about, do you refrigerate it? Do you do a burial at sea and eject it into space? Do you do, I think the process is called promession, where you freeze the body and then shake it until it turns into dust and could deal with it in a more compact fashion? Or do you bring it home for proper burial back on Earth? Or do you bury it at your destination, whether it be Mars, the moon, or somewhere else? Any thoughts on that front?
Well, let's kind of take it a step at a time.
Sure.
One thing, if you ever flew in a government jet or did anything in the government, one of the first things that you will go through, and in the civilian world, I don't necessarily get this, but in the government world, the first thing you do is go, okay, if things go wrong, here's what we do. And it scares, the average person who's never been there before. If things go wrong, here's what you do. If there's a fire, there's the exit. So same practice will happen with the astronauts. It's like, if things go wrong, what do you want to happen? So you have to talk to a crew in advance and just kind of get individual preferences. So what do they even want? I mean, it may be somebody's great idea to go, well, I don't really want to die on this mission, but if I died, it'd be really cool to have a burial at sea, let's say, into space. So, get their individual preferences, and then try to work towards that. You mentioned refrigeration. Again, that's one of those things that during normal times on the planet, you have ample access to cold storage for a cadaver, a body. That's a whole lot of volume on a space vehicle, just to place one body. So there's going to have to be a real discussion about, can we even create a space to place a body and refrigerate it to keep it from decomposing, and then you decide, do you take it to the planet? Which I would assume, and I don't know, details of these discussions in any program. I would assume that we're not going to try to bury a body on a planet, on the moon or on Mars. I do know we work very hard towards not contaminating, the planet. So It seems to me like this might be a little bit of a contamination question or problem to deal with. So I wouldn't think that's top of the list. Probably just guessing what NASA would think is they would try to figure out how to bring the body back to the U.S. or back to planet Earth, which is the hardest thing to do. So that's probably the initial the way the government would want to handle something like this, for sensitivities for the person who's passed away, for the right visibility in a program. We're not going to leave anyone behind. What is it? The Marine Corps, we don't leave anyone behind kind of idea. So I'd imagine that's kind of the hardest thing to do. And if you're going to do that, we've got to talk about cold storage, because you can't have a body not in a refrigerated environment. And I don't even know how cold it has to be, but it's got to be a pretty cool area. So that's going to be power. That's part of the power, mass, volume mantra. That's going to be a tough decision to allocate that much volume and mass for this particular situation. So that's going to be challenging.
Bill, this might be a bit...
Let me just follow up with one quick point, Geoff. You bring up a good point. We spend a lot of time and energy and money on planetary protection. So, for instance, anything that goes to Mars has to be sterilized very rigorously. And if it's going anywhere where it might encounter liquid water, it has to meet an entirely whole higher standard that goes above and beyond. So the idea of leaving a human body there, which is basically a big bacteria farm, is probably not a good one. I think there's a lot of people that think that the toxins and the perchlorates in the soil and the radiation would probably sterilize things pretty quickly, but you're just asking for trouble. So I think that's a good point. Moon might be a different story. Geoff, please go ahead.
I'd never thought about this idea of potential contamination, and we strive so hard to remove all human waste from Antarctica that it's something of a similar concept. But Bill, the question I really wanted to ask you is, this may seem a bit cold, and I don't mean that to be a pun, but let's posit we have a long duration space flight. One of the crew has passed away, and you described the situation where, if assuming the body would be brought back to Earth, it would have to be refrigerated. Would there be a circumstance in which you could store that body on the exterior of the spacecraft?
I can't answer to the technicalities of that. So in theory, you think you could put it in the shade, so to speak, and it'd stay pretty cool. So I guess it's something I'd ask the engineers if they can make that happen. And that might be a way forward, but I don't technically know the answer to that question.
And these are things that we're going to have to prepare for in the long term. And it reminds me of advances and discussions that are taking place in space law regarding ownership of resources in space. So the legalities of handling deceased astronauts and perhaps in the future space tourists, travelers, is something that's going to have to be worked on. Who's going to do that? Which body will be the one? Sorry, again, no pun intended. Which organization or group will be responsible for coming up with procedures to deal with this? Do you think?
The analogies that come to my mind are airplane travel and then transoceanic, in international waters. How is that handled? I know a little more about aviation than the sea. And in aviation, generally, a person's pronounced officially after they land. So where do they land? And again, the legal situation comes into play there. I don't know how it works with the international waters. If you're on one of these cruises, they have a lot of people. Surely they know what happens because they have, an older population and have thousands. We haven't even had 1,000 people in space yet. My goodness. So I guess they'd be a good analog to look into right now.
Well, so I'm going to take a little bit of a leap here, so I'll apologize in advance, but you're the guy, so I'm going to ask. If I look back at science fiction, I can imagine if you're in Earth orbit, you'd probably want to bring the body home, but you could simply eject it into a decaying orbit and allow it to re-enter, which is kind of an elegant form of cremation. You could do the same at Mars. When satellites reach a certain point in their life where they're no longer functional, they're sometimes shuttled out to what are appropriately called graveyard orbits, pun intended. And then I guess in the long term, if you've got a settlement that's far from Earth and has to be self-supporting, there are things about bodies that can be reused and recycled. Any thoughts on any of those processes?
Well, low Earth orbit, you're going to bring the body home, and that's not going to be fun for the people who come back. Right now, if you go to the International Space Station, there is basically one seat per astronaut. And let's say it's a bad day and you have to get off station for whatever reason. They all have their assigned seats. They get in their vehicle and they come home. So there's not extra seating anywhere. So if someone actually passes away, they're going to come home eventually. And so somebody's going to be sitting next to their very good colleague and friend. So that's going to have big psychological issues. And I'm sure, the psych side of the house is doing their best to prepare for one of those days. But that's going to be no fun. It's like being on an airplane. If the guy next to you dies, where do they move this person? And what if there's nowhere to – I don't know. I don't want to be sitting next to the individual, right?
Well, they'd be very quiet.
Have you ever – they won't complain. Have you ever
That's right.
seen the inside of the Soyuz? You're packed in there like sardines.
It's small. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like there's going to be a lot of space between you and this deceased person. So it's not going to be a good day, that's for sure. But that's low Earth orbit. Bring them home and deal with the psychological trauma. You mentioned, what about body reuse? So I'll say a couple things about death, decay, that sort of stuff. First off, human bodies don't become suddenly toxic because you die. There may be people who believe that the body is like going to be bad for your health. But you know what? The bacteria that's in your body when you're alive, they just they do their thing, and there's no counter process. Your body doesn't get rid of the gases. You start decomposing. So the point is the body itself, just because your heart stops beating, isn't suddenly toxic. So it's not an emergency to get rid of the body for the health of everybody else. Well, you may say, well, what about in these disasters when a hurricane comes along or a tsunami, and all of a sudden there's hundreds or thousands of dead bodies? You've got to get rid of those, because we have seen where there are health outbreaks, bad things happen. Well, let's take a step back and look at the situation in the first place. If there's a hurricane, you've lost power, you've lost water. You lose some infrastructure items you're going to have sickness and public health issues to deal with just from that. It just so happens you've got lots of bodies, and we do need to take care of them, but they're not exactly an emergency because the body's suddenly toxic. It's a different story if the person dies from Ebola, if they die from a real pathogen that could spread. But if you die from a heart attack, that's not a bacterial pathogen, and you're not suddenly toxic. So you decompose, and we really don't want to see that or experience that. And that's why you preserve the body one way or another. And we have lots of methods on the ground that won't be available in space for a while, because it's going to be, we're just new at this. We can only get so much stuff off planet Earth and into space. So it's going to be definitely limited resource. I don't know about the idea of reusing protein and energy from the human body. At least in theory, you certainly could do that. But I think culturally, it's a very big mental step to get beyond. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
That's a good point. And you brought up the Soyuz. If somebody's gone and decaying in the Soyuz, I'm definitely leaving them inside their pressure suit. We will be back to continue this rosy discussion after this short break. And we're back. Geoffrey, I think you have a question.
I certainly do. Bill, we're lifelong science fiction fans on This Week in Space, and Rod and I have had many discussions on related topics. In sci-fi movies, television, comic books, we've seen over and over again instances of someone being spaced, of a character being thrown out of an airlock, or someone trying to make a jump from one thing to another without a spacesuit. Famously, when Dave Bowman holds his breath and exits the pod trying to get back into the ship in 2001. What would really happen to an unprotected body in space? And is Dave Bowman's little excursion there where he holds his breath and launches himself into the airlock, is such a thing even possible in the real world of space flight physics?
So some background that would help inform us is aviation. In the aviation world, we fly at pretty high altitudes. You get up into the 40s, 30s and 40s of thousands of feet. And if those airplanes have a sudden decompression, people will feel it. Obviously, air will go out of your lungs. It can be sucked out of your lungs. Your ears pop, of course. And then for the pilots, in commercial aircraft, they're required to have a quick don mask. And the reason they have a quick don mask, which literally, you go in the cockpit, they reach over their shoulder and they go whoop, and they get this oxygen mask on their face, and now they're breathing oxygen. Oxygen's key to staying conscious. If you suddenly don't have oxygen available, you have a certain amount that's in the blood, still in the brain and in the body, and you're going to stay conscious until that level drops below functionality for you, and you go unconscious. So this is called time of useful consciousness. It gets down to about 10 to 15 seconds when you're in the upper atmosphere, say 40,000 feet. Okay, so we know you can reach back here, quick don a mask, and the pilots can keep flying an airplane and deal with the rest of the situation after that. There's another incident that happened once at NASA in a vacuum chamber. You'll probably know about it. Heck, it was in the 60s, maybe the 70s. I'm not even sure what year that was. It was before I was there. And an individual's on a treadmill in a spacesuit, a pressure suit, hooked up to a pressure line. You can see this video on the internet if you haven't seen it. This tells us what will happen to an individual if they go out into a vacuum. Because what happened for this man was the hose popped off. He suddenly goes to vacuum, like in the chamber. He's walking. Moments, seconds. I haven't counted the seconds, but 5 seconds. and he just goes, boop, boom. He falls over. If he stays in the vacuum, he won't get up. He will die. If you go from the pod to through some door, like in that movie you mentioned, if you go quick enough and somehow you're able to reestablish an atmosphere, as happened in that vacuum chamber, he woke up moments later after the vacuum chamber. They hit an emergency dump valve and they open these big old valves and whoop, atmosphere comes back in. He woke up. Didn't have lasting permanent effects at all. So he's in that environment for 30 seconds maybe, and then there's significant pressure coming in pretty fast. So if you can get from your pod to this other site and establish an atmosphere that keeps you alive, you can do that. In the meantime, while you're in the vacuum, what this individual actually talks about is, we've seen, what was that movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger? Not Terminator, but The Martian.
Total Recall.
Total Recall.
Oh,
and
yes.
he went outside the habitat and his face is bubbling all. Oh, Hollywood. You won't have that. What this individual experienced was tingling on his tongue, bubbling on his tongue as gases evolved out of his saliva. His skin did not, puff up, that sort of thing. There is actually one other situation I'm just thinking about. There was an individual in a balloon, Joe Kittinger, in 1968 or so. He was at tens of thousands of feet headed to 104,000 feet or so, and his glove on his right hand became loose. So he lost pressure, and it was most concerted right there in that right hand. He had pain. He had embolism, which is a little bit of the expanding of the gases because they don't have pressure out here. So there will be some gas expansion. He completed his mission, and in 1990s, maybe early 2000s, actually shook his hand. I think he's still alive today. He's not a spring chicken anymore, but he's still alive and well today. And that right hand works just fine. So going out into space, you'll lose consciousness. And if you don't get put in an atmosphere that makes you survive, you'll just die. But I don't expect you'll do a bunch of bubbling and blow up.
Well, this is fantastic news, Bill. I am so relieved to hear this because I was always afraid that if it happened to us, we would actually explode or melt. So if you can believe it, a Hollywood film, in this case, Total Recall, was not strictly scientifically accurate, but still great fun and based on a short story by Philip K. Dick, one of the greats. So our imaginary character who is holding his breath, or as exemplified by Dave Bowman in 2001. So we've got the narrow window of oxygen deprivation, as demonstrated in your story about the high altitude pilots. We have this strange phenomenon of passing out quickly due to the vacuum. What about temperature? Would the extremely low temperature of a space traveler cause damage to the skin, or is he or she still going to make it with holding the breath, moving quickly?
Yeah, if you don't have a spacesuit is an environment. It's like a little spaceship. So those guys doing the spacewalks on the space station, they're in their own little spacesuit. The Russians just completed one, actually, with the first female from Europe, Isa, doing a Russian Orla on the EVA. So congrats to Samantha Cristoforetti. And a successful spacewalk. Let's see. So the cold, oxygen is going to be your first problem. If you get past the oxygen situation, sure, that's definitely too cold for your survival. And on planet Earth, if you get in a blizzard, and it's only minus 50, that's a problem. You'll get frostbite pretty quick, and it gets a lot colder than that in the shade in space. So you don't have much time you can spend in the cold either. So those both are working against you.
So our takeaway is that we probably could make it maybe 30 seconds if any of us ever have to jump from airlock to airlock without a spacesuit. We might just make it.
You're going to need some help at the other end.
So relieved to hear this. Okay,
yes.
Bill, thank you for sharing your expertise on this problem that has bothered me since I was a kid.
Well, you need to watch more episodes of For All Mankind where they wrap themselves up in duct tape to run from one part of the lunar surface to the other. Okay.
Yeah.
Of course, they did die at the end of that. But so just changing. Huh?
Don't ruin it.
What?
Sorry. You should give spoiler alerts there. Everybody dies at the end, don't worry.
Yeah. Spock dies. A slight change in trajectory here. I know that you and I talked before I wrote Space 2.0 quite a bit about life support on the space station, and you illuminated some things that I knew absolutely nothing about, like carbon dioxide pockets and so forth. So I realize environmental control and life support is a huge deal. So as we head off to Mars, where we can't just deorbit and come back to Earth in a matter of minutes or hours, and let's say somebody was carrying a communicable disease or something percolates up in somebody's system, having just come through a pandemic. I mean, I assume people would probably be cleared before they got on the spacecraft, but let's just say something happens or we have a settlement on Mars and something communicable comes around. Obviously, there would be certain options for quarantine and so forth, but has there been much thought put into that and how that'll be dealt with?
Well, I'm not going to say it can't happen. One of my favorite space sci-fi movies is called It, The Terror from Space.
Yes.
Does that ring a bell for you? Where did that come from, right? First off, they sent one ship, and then they sent a second ship, but that's a different story. So I guess it could happen, but there's a very strong program in any nation that takes the likelihood of any kind of communicable disease, a cold, a flu, a COVID, and you're in isolation for quite a while before you launch, and that gets you through all the time period that these diseases take to develop. But say, despite all the medical tests that look for things like, say, tuberculosis, because it could kind of be quiet, you wouldn't know you even had it, but we can find it. So we look for these things. We give you a period of time that you're isolated so that Uncle Joe doesn't give you something. If that is maintained for the scenarios we're talking about, then the probability of taking something with you is extremely small. But space brings weird things. We don't expect them. Who knew an astronaut might drown in space, right? That was a new one for me.
So you're talking about the helmet that had the malfunctioning water valve?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That got pretty exciting for a little while there.
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
Yeah. If a contagion somehow sneaks through all this, or let's say bacteria gets really mean in space, we do have some data that shows the bacteria could become more virulent with time and exposure on a space environment. Different radiation, I guess, is what does it. There's nowhere to isolate. I mean, if you do isolate, even on the space station, which is relatively large, a multi-bedroom apartment or house kind of situation, you're hard pressed to isolate. Air circulation, because of things like gases and developing gas pockets, zero G, no heat rising and cold sinking. That's all that stuff doesn't come into play in a zero G environment. You have a lot of air movement. Filtration to be in the system, so hopefully it would pick up most everything. But I don't know how you for quite a while, until we have much larger vehicles of some nature, there's no isolation. The crew is going to share everything that's in the air.
Yeah, good and bad.
So contagions could spread very quickly. Well, this leads perfectly onto my next question, Bill. I read your PDF, Occupational Surveillance for Spaceflight Exposures, which I found online, was very interesting. And you talk a little bit there about how weight-bearing bones and muscles deteriorate over time. And this is, of course, is one of the challenges that astronauts will have to face during very long duration spaceflight. Do you have any insight, research, thoughts about strategies in which astronauts may be able to combat this deterioration, and perhaps any relevance you might like to comment on with the Mark Kelly, Scott Kelly comparative study that it was?
As far as bones and muscle, and actually just everything physiology wise, use it or lose it. Muscles, you use different muscles, but you don't need near as much force, so your muscles will not maintain the same amount of strength and capability as they do in 1G. But all it really takes is a good little push with a hand, and you can just float all the way down the space station, let's say. So muscles will, go to where they need to be while you're floating in space. Same way with the bones. We have not really seen where your bones will stop getting weaker. So we don't want to allow that to happen, because our plan still is for people to return to Earth. And Earth is a big physiologic challenge if you've been off it and you've been floating. So I've said for decades now, Star Trek got it right. We should not be floating around our ship. We should be walking. So some form of gravity is necessary to maintain human physiology like we have it on Earth. How much gravity, we don't know. Can we use some new technology engine-wise, something that gives us a steady G-force? Going to the moon, you'll get there a lot faster. I don't know anything on the horizon right now that would give you, let's say, half a G, let alone 1G. And in the movies, we don't know what the G-force is, but they all look like they're walking around on planet Earth. So assume they're 1G. But someday, human physiology-wise, we'll learn whether you need 1/3 G, 1/6 G like on the moon, or 1G to maintain the human physiology such that you can return to planet Earth. If your plan is just to go to Mars, then 1/3 G is going to be plenty for you. But when you come back to Earth, that's where it's going to be tough. And we don't have a ground-based analog. We don't have a situation where we can really test this long-term on the planet. You can't get away from the gravitational force on the planet. There are things called bed rest studies where we have you lay down, and they test certain parts of the physiology, and your bones will get thin if you just lay around. We already see that with couch potatoes, so we could tell you when you don't exercise your bones and your muscles, they waste away. They'll only waste so much on planet Earth, and they'll go further, no doubt, in 0G if allowed. So I'm quite interested in figuring out what's going to be the magic break point for how much G is needed while we're traveling. Because 1G is a lot of force, and it's going to take a lot of structure to maintain a vehicle in a 1G environment. I'm pretty sure it doesn't have to be 1G to get us back to the Earth and do okay. So, well, we can't figure that out without going either to the moon or Mars and be in their gravitational force for a significant period of time.
Well, and as you mentioned, this is really something you can't simulate well on Earth. I know they do bed rest studies and so forth, but for instance, when you're talking about in terms of human settlement of other planets or free space, when you talk about human reproduction in low gravity environments, that's something, as far as I know at this point, we know almost nothing about, right?
Yeah, it's coming. One of these days, a couple will go into space and try to make a baby in space, because that's going to be pretty notable. It'll make you famous, I'm sure. I don't want to be that fetus. We don't know what's going to happen at all. So, of course, we can't recommend you go do that. But in the commercial world, I anticipate one of these days, sooner than later, someone's going to say, we made a baby in space. And then it will depend how long you stay in space. Of course, if you're only up there for, I don't know, a week, a couple of weeks. I don't know if that's enough to actually have a real effect on a developing fetus, but it's not going to be the same as being on planet Earth. But I don't think any of it will be to the benefit of the fetus.
Yeah.
And
well,
Bill,
we don't want that.
You mentioned earlier about the follow-up care that NASA provides to astronauts, and I saw you make mention of that also in your PDF, the idea that NASA should assume responsibility for the lifelong health and care of active and former astronauts. So I don't know, this may be a bit of a nebulous question, but is there evidence of long-term lasting damage or deterioration to those astronauts who have spent more time in space than others? Is there any evidence for that?
So there's the program called Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health is the one that's looking to find that out, and they will publish from time to time findings. And I'm a little reticent to say anything because I might not remember things right, and I don't want to get quoted to say they're dying of this or that. So I'll be a little generic here, but one, it turns out astronauts are generally healthier than non-astronauts. Imagine that. And that carries through their lifetime. So they tend to live long and perform doing things like CEOs of some incredible companies well into their aged years, whatever that is. So they start off at a higher than average place than me, the average Joe, let's say. So how much that protects them versus let's call it an insult, but saying insult might not be the right word, because I have heard one of the astronauts say, going into space is like the fountain of youth. And I've interpreted that to mean, your shoulders don't hurt and your musculoskeletal system's happier floating in space versus trying to sleep on your side in the bed or something. But so there may be actual health benefit to going into space versus only bad things. And along those lines, we absolutely know one thing for certain, and that is astronauts die more often of space vehicle accidents versus others. That's for sure. Clearly, statistically, they die more often in space accidents. Other issues are a lot closer to in the statistical messiness of having only a few subjects in your subject base compared to, and what population do you even compare against? That's a whole nother issue. If you try to compare a healthy 40-year-old astronaut against a not healthy permanent, some insurance group of 40-year-old males, they may not really compare because they live different lifestyles. So all that being said, space accidents is what they die of more often than the rest of the population, and other things are a lot closer to maybe not more often in astronauts.
Thank you.
Well, Bill, this has been a delight, and I just want to volunteer here and now in public. If you ever need somebody on the other end of the physical fitness spectrum for an astronaut, I will volunteer to be the baseline on your study. So I'm just putting that out there.
Noted.
Thanks for making time for us. It's been fun to catch up with you again to talk about this somewhat uncomfortable aspect of space exploration. Where can we keep track of your activities and learn more about what you do?
Let's see. Well, I don't put a lot out. Do you want a Twitter account or something?
Or really, just where we can go on the NASA website to see more about what you guys are up to.
That's a pretty interesting thing because I'm in space medicine, Johnson Space Center. That'll probably get you as close as possible to what we put on the public side. I don't even go look at the public side of this stuff, so I don't really know.
Well, you're working there. You don't have to, right?
Sorry about that.
Not a problem. Geoffrey, same question. Different answer.
Thank you, Rod. First, I want to thank Bill for being on the show and sharing his expertise. What a fascinating episode, and as I said earlier, clearing up this thing that's pretty much bugged me my whole life, which is if I can hold my breath for 30 seconds in space, I have a pretty good chance of making it to the airlock. You go, Dave Bowman. And if you want to connect with me, hey, well, I owned up at the beginning I'm a science fiction fanatic, and don't pretend that you're not. So, a very apropos to this episode, I've got space in my bones. I'm a meteorite professional, and if anyone would like to learn more about space rocks or connect with me online, I am the founder of Aerolite Meteorites. That's aerolite.org. And I am active on social media at Geoff Notkin, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, you name it.
And as less of a social media presence, I can, in fact, be found at pylebooks.com, pylebooks.com, or at astromagazine.com, where my magazine lives. Don't forget to drop us a line at twis@twit.tv. That's twis@twit.tv. We welcome your comments, suggestions, and ideas. I want to thank you all for joining us. And if you have anything you want to tell us, drop that email and we'll be sure to respond to it on the air sooner or later. New episodes published every Friday on your favorite podcatcher, so make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, and review. 5 stars or a thumbs up will do nicely. Thank you. You can also head to our website at twit.tv/TWIS. You can also follow the Twit Tech Podcast Network at Twit on Twitter and on Facebook and twit.tv on Instagram. Hey, do it all. We're very interesting people. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club Twit. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club Twit Discord, a great clubhouse for Twit listeners. And finally, the Twit Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.